Imagine a man who, sensing that his health is deteriorating, enclosed himself in his room in the night when the chores and obligations of the day were muted and his mind could be fully immersed in his creative project until death caught up with him at the wise age of 51. Hello and welcome to Exhibitionista's Notes on Art, your art wonderment podcast. I am your host, Joana P. Neves, and this is the podcast where we explore art through histories, philosophies, exhibitions, biographies, and also through texts that I try to read as best as I can. Today I'm asking a simple and yet very common question, which is, how can I know if the art that I'm enjoying is any good? Which is to say, how do we recognize artistic greatness? And is this really the way to define it? So the tools that we have to perceive singular, unique works of art are probably the ones that we have developed across a lifetime. So how do we know whether we have the tools that fit the unique shape of something that presents to us as completely and utterly new? The man who cut himself off from the world in the last period of his life asks precisely that question in his oeuvre of a lifetime. I'm talking about the French author Marcel Proust, born in 1871 and who died in 1922, way too early. His father was an epidemiologist and his mother came from a prosperous Jewish family. She had an artistic flair that she imbued in her very frail child. He indeed found the right format for his work, which became 7 volumes of an oeuvre that explores sexuality, desire, art, and the mundane and the spiritual, and how they are entangled in a complex and kaleidoscopic web. I'm talking about a series of books that have 2 titles in English, actually. The first one is Remembrance of Things Past. It was a translation by C.K. Scott Moncrief, and I have to say that Marcel Proust hated this title. The current one comes from a translation that was heralded by D.J. Enfield, is a literal transcription or a literal translation from the French title, À la recherche du temps perdu, and it is very simply In Search of Lost Time. You would think that my excerpts would come from the last translation and the most current one, but because I, sweet listeners, read in French, I had to purchase a Kindle version in English, and the one that I put my claws on was precisely Remembrance of Things Past. It cost less than £1. So there it is. And most of the excerpts that I'm going to read come from the first part of this 7-volume monument of a work. Those 7 volumes follow the narrator from childhood into adulthood. And the excerpt that I'm about to read, and that introduces the question that we have in common with Marcel, is having a moment of reckoning in this particular passage regarding talent and the way the adults around him talk about it and perceive it. The author they're mentioning here is Bergotte, who was the favorite writer of the narrator. And side note, notice how Proust's names are so fragrant. They're alliterative, like Vinteuil and Verdurin, respectively, a composer and a family that is going to be quite important across all of the books. But they also work like a sort of a distorted memory. So Bergotte, to me at least, speaks of bergamot, or reminds me of bergamot, which is a condiment used in Earl Grey tea. And Marcel Proust was incredibly fond of the writings by the British critic John Ruskin. His mother had told him about the writer and critic, and Proust was absolutely devoted to his writings to the point where he even translated them. So his English was a bit patchy. It was by no means any good. But he did say that even if he didn't speak English, he did speak Ruskin. So in my mind, Bergotte and Bergamot, these two words echoing each other, might be sort of an homage to one of his favorite writers. But we also know that Bergotte, the character, the writer, was also inspired by Anatole France, who was a great writer of the time, quite revered, and who Proust, at least in the beginning of his life, really enjoyed as well. So who knows? But the reality is that there is a game of mirrors when you're creating. And here, Marcel Proust tried to create a huge distance between himself by introducing a narrator that remains nameless until the end of the book, and also a time that is always very imprecise, and that you have to weave yourself as a reader in regards to the events that are mentioned and that are historical events. But it is also a peculiar and quite accurate vision of childhood, pre-teenagehood, and teenagehood, whereby there is moments of immense maturity and moments also of childishness. And the fact that we never quite know the age of the narrator makes for a really impressionistic and much more complex view of that particular period of our lives, where we are so many mixed things. We're so ignorant and at the same time so wise and so absorbent that we have the information at the tip of our tongue and also straight into our brains, and allows us, or allowed us when we were younger, to produce such accurate thoughts. So bear in mind that here in this excerpt, the narrator is probably a teenager, but the pertinent view that he has on the notion of talent is quite interesting, and is very close to the question that we're asking ourselves today. So here we go, onto the excerpt. They would say of Bergotte, he has a charming mind, so individual. He has a way of his own of saying things, which is a little far-fetched, but so pleasant. You never need to look for his name on the title page. You can tell his work at once. But none of them had yet gone so far as to say, he is a great writer, he has great talent. They did not even credit him with talent at all. They did not speak because they were not aware of it. We are very slow in recognizing in the peculiar physiognomy of a new writer the type which is labeled great talent in our Museum of General Ideas. Simply because that physiognomy is new and strange, we can find in it no resemblance to what we are accustomed to call talent. We say rather originality, charm, delicacy, strength, and then one day we add up the sum of these and find that it amounts simply to talent. Here in this particular passage, it is quite interesting to see that he is shocked by the way the adults around him talk about Bergotte, who he finds to be an absolute genius. They never talk about him as having conquered the place in the pantheon of great writers. They find other adjectives for him. And this is interesting because it is going to be very useful later on, because the way we talk about talent is as important as having a notion that we are encountering precisely that kind of depth of talent. But also, he talks about the experience of novelty. And the word experience is very, very interesting here. So the empirical encounter through an embodied experience, either of a text, but also of a performance, as we will see later on, or a painting, or any other form of art. So the word experience has my favorite prefix, which is X. X is an interesting prefix that comes from Latin and even way before that. And it is a prefix that talks about time and that talks about space. It is a movement from within to outside, to an outer realm. It also is a movement from within a community to beyond the borders of that community. It also talks about something that was formerly in a certain state or of a certain status, as when we say my ex-partner, for example. And so X is a really beautiful little word that has a sort of a movement that is either in space or in time. And then you have the word peritus, which is a word that in conjunction with X does make the word experience. That comes also from Latin. And peritus is a word that exists in Portuguese, perito, which means expertise. But before meaning expertise, it means to risk by repetition, to risk going into a certain realm of experience, a certain experimentation. It also means knowledge by repetition. And therefore, the word experience comes from this idea of a movement towards from an inner state to an outwardly state. Whereas when we talk about experience, we imagine receiving an information. We are facing novelty and we are open to whatever comes from the outside. But here, the word and the root of the word experience can actually mean both directions, from the outside to an inner state, and from an inner availability or from an inner faculty to an outside experience or perception. It also means taking a risk. And I want you to keep this idea of risk, to follow the narrator's experience in what is going to be a challenge to this very pertinent reckoning that he has in this passage here, which is that there is no risk taking by the adults. This idea of risk taking is really important, but the narrator himself is going, and this position that he has, this very pertinent awareness that he comes to, is going to be challenged by a character called Berma. Berma is the greatest actress of the time of the narrator. And of course, Proust, and you can hear it in the sound of the name Berma, got his inspiration straight from the great actress of the turn of the 20th century, Sarah Bernhardt. She was a character. She was an incredible actress from the accounts of the time. And one of the things that she was the most famous for was her acting in Racine's very famous play, in Racine's very famous play, The Phèdre. You just need to know that the character who is speaking is Swan, who gives the first part of the 7 volumes, its title, Swan's Way. Swan was a friend of the narrator's family. He was an urban, wealthy, sophisticated character and a reserved man who, in this moment of the narrative, had fallen in love with what was called a cocotte, so a woman who traded her favors for money. He ended up marrying her, and therefore he couldn't visit the narrator's family with his own family. The excerpt that you're about to listen to is the moment when the Berma character starts infiltrating the protagonist's mind and weaving itself into his impressions and reflections about art. When we could say he starts gathering his tools to have his own relationship with aesthetic experiences. So let's go. Let's move on to the next excerpt. The narrator asks Swan what Bergotte considers to be his favorite actor, and Swan replies, "Actor? No, I can't say, but I do know this. There's not a man on the stage whom he thinks equal to Berma. He puts her above everyone. Have you seen her? No, sir, my parents do not allow me to go to the theatre. That is a pity. You should insist. Berma in Phèdre, in the Cid. Well, she's only an actress, if you like, but you know that I don't believe very much in the hierarchy of the arts. As he spoke, I noticed what had often struck me before in his conversations with my grandmother's sisters, that whenever he spoke of serious matters, whenever he used an expression which seemed to imply a definite opinion upon some important subject, he would take care to isolate, to sterilize it by using a special intonation, mechanical and ironic, as though he had put the phrase or word between inverted commas and was anxious to disclaim any personal responsibility for it. As who should say, the hierarchy, don't you know, as silly people call it. But then, if it was so absurd, why did he say the hierarchy? A moment later, he went on. Her acting will give you as noble an inspiration as any masterpiece of art in the world as, oh, I don't know, and he began to laugh. Shall we say the Queens of Chartres? Until then, I had supposed that his horror of having to give a serious opinion was something Parisian and refined, in contrast to the provincial dogmatism of my grandmother's sisters. And I had imagined also that it was characteristic of the mental attitude towards life of the circle in which Swann moved, where, by a natural reaction from the lyrical enthusiasms of earlier generations, an excessive importance was given to small and precise facts, formerly regarded as vulgar, and anything in the nature of phrase-making was banned. But now I found myself slightly shocked by his attitude, which Swann invariably adopted when face to face with generalities. He appeared unwilling to risk even having an opinion, and to be at his ease only when he could furnish, with meticulous accuracy, some precise but unimportant detail. But in so doing, he did not take into account that even here he was giving an opinion, holding a brief, as they say, for something, that the accuracy of his details had an importance of its own. I thought again of the dinner that night, when I had been so unhappy because Mamma would not be coming up to my room, and when he had dismissed the balls given by the Princesse de Léon as being of no importance. And yet it was to just that sort of amusement that he was devoting his life. For what other kind of existence did he reserve the duties of saying in all seriousness what he thought about things, of formulating judgments which he would not put between inverted commas? And when would he cease to give himself up to occupations of which at the same time he made out that they were absurd? Notice that in this really interesting excerpt, the narrator is judging Swann, the character who he admired greatly, and finding out that this affectation was an artifice, and this artifice seemed to have taken the place of his real character. So the narrator here interweaves a relationship to art and a relationship to truth, even in behaviors in life. So the question that is very deeply felt by the character, and here I think this is really also characteristic of our teenage years, is this sort of disappointment with the realization that perhaps Swann, who he admired so much, wasn't in touch with his own subjectivity. And the notion of risk, the notion of empiria, of empirical relationship with things, with experience, was also saying something about life and vice versa. The quest for truth is not, at least in Marcel Proust's work, In Search of Lost Time, only directed towards art. Art is not something in this book that tells us truths that we cannot perceive in life. It is actually the entanglement, the interweaving of awarenesses, of moments of reckoning in real life, but also in aesthetic experience that actually provide a deeper truth that is somewhat the encounter between all of those kaleidoscopic, multifaceted relationships that we have across our lives, and in which art is but one of them. It is also in this passage that Berma, the character La Berma, is introduced. And she is introduced in a very subtle way as being cut away from the possibilities of experiences for the narrator. And the reason why he is not allowed to go to the theater is because of his ill health. So the narrator wants to be a writer, and his family is firmly against it. But through meeting an ambassador called Monsieur de Norpois, his father changes his mind progressively. Monsieur de Norpois is the one who convinces the narrator's father that this can be a respectful occupation for a grown-up. Monsieur de Norpois also convinces the narrator's father to allow him to go to the theater. And so the perspective of finally going and experiencing the greatness of Berma is starting to take shape in the narrator's mind. Something happens, an incredible challenge for the narrator, and that brings about a lot of questions in regards to his vocation and his desire to become a writer, and also in the self-evaluation of himself and of his own talent. So the intricacies of this experience are quite varied, they are quite dense and complex, and they slowly start to build a new relationship to art making, to experiencing art, and to how we talk about and reference and judge ultimately art. So the family tells the narrator that he should write to Monsieur de Norpois a little note, and he is faced suddenly with his own inability of writing under the pressure of having to produce a piece of literature, as he evidently considered this to be, for someone who actually supported his vocation. And he's intensely, immensely, incredibly frustrated with his own perceived lack of talent. So this is the next excerpt for you to understand the process that he undergoes before actually going to the theater and being in the very heart of experience of a work of art. After a few labored pages, weariness made the pen drop from my fingers. I cried with anger at the thought that I should never have any talent, that I was not gifted, that I could not even take advantage of the chance that Monsieur de Norpois' coming visit was to offer me of spending the rest of my life in Paris. The recollection that I was to be taken to hear Berma alone distracted me from my grief. But just as I did not wish to see any storms except on those coasts where they raged with most violence, so I should not have cared to hear the great actress, except in one of those classic parts in which Swann had told me that she touched the sublime. For when it is in the hope of making a priceless discovery that we desire to receive certain impressions from nature or from works of art, we have certain scruples about allowing our soul to gather, instead of these, other, inferior impressions, which are liable to make us form a false estimate of the value of beauty. Berma in Andromaque, in Les Caprices de Marianne, in Phèdre, was one of those famous spectacles which my imagination had so long desired. I should enjoy the same rapture as on the day when in a gondola I glided to the foot of the Titian of the Frari or the Carpaccios of San Giorgio dei Schiavoni, were I ever to hear Berma repeat the lines beginning, On dit qu'un prompt départ vous éloigne de nous, Seigneur. I was familiar with them from the simple reproduction in black and white, which was given of them upon the printed page. But my heart beat furiously at the thought, as of the realization of a long-planned voyage, that I should at length behold them, bathed and brought to life in the atmosphere and sunshine of the voice of gold. A Carpaccio in Venice, Berma in Phèdre, masterpieces of pictorial or dramatic art which the glamour, the dignity, watch attaching to them made so living to me, that is to say, so indivisible, that if I had been taken to see Carpaccios in one of the galleries of the Louvre, or Berma in some piece of which I had never heard, I should not have experienced the same delicious amazement at finding myself at length, with wide open eyes, before the unique and inconceivable object of so many thousand dreams. Then, while I waited, expecting to derive from Berma's playing the revelation of certain aspects of nobility and tragic grief, it would seem to me that whatever greatness, whatever truth there might be in her playing, must be enhanced if the actress imposed it upon a work of real value, instead of what would, after all, be but embroidering a pattern of truth and beauty upon a commonplace and vulgar web. Finally, if I went to hear Berma in a new piece, it would not be easy for me to judge of her art, of her diction, since I should not be able to differentiate between a text which was not already familiar and what she added to it by her intonations and gestures, an addition which would seem to me to be embodied in the play itself. Whereas the old plays, the classics which I knew by heart, presented themselves to me as vast and empty walls, reserved and made ready for my inspection, on which I should be able to appreciate without restriction the devices by which Berma would cover them, as with frescoes, with the perpetually fresh treasures of her inspiration. Unfortunately, for some years now, since she had retired from great theatres to make the fortune of one on the boulevards where she was the star, she had ceased to appear in classic parts, and in vain did I scan the hoardings. They never advertised any but the newest pieces, written specially for her by authors in fashion at the moment. When, one morning, as I stood searching the column of announcements to find the afternoon performances for the week of the New Year holidays, I saw there for the first time, at the foot of the bill, after some probably insignificant curtain raiser, whose title was opaque to me because it had latent in it all the details of an action of which I was ignorant, 2 acts of Phèdre with Madame Berma, and on the following afternoons, Le Demi-Monde, Les Caprices de Marianne, names which, like that of Phèdre, were for me transparent, filled with light only, so familiar were those works to me, illuminated to their very depths by the revealing smile of art. They seemed to me to invest with a fresh nobility Madame Berma herself, when I read in the newspapers, after the program of these performances, that it was she who had decided to shew herself once more to the public in some of her early creations. She was conscious, then, that certain stage parts have an interest which survives the novelty of their first production or the success of a revival. She regarded them, when interpreted by herself, as museum pieces, which it might be instructive to set before the eyes of the generation which had admired her in them long ago, or of that which had never yet seen her in them, in thus advertising, in the middle of a column of plays intended only to while away an evening, this Phèdre, a title no longer than any of the rest, nor set in different type. She added something indescribable, as though a hostess, introducing you, before you all go in to dinner, to her other guests, were to mention casually, amid the string of names which are names of guests and nothing more, and without any change of tone, Monsieur Anatole France. One of the things that is characteristic of Marcel Proust's writing is his very, very, very long sentences that can be much more than a page long. They also work a little bit like matryoshkas. So they open up to an illustration, but that illustration needs to be explained and contextualized. And therefore, we have an explanation of an explanation of an explanation that goes back to the beginning of the argument by Marcel Proust. So that makes for a challenging read. In some ways, it can be seen as a sort of an asthmatic way of writing because he seems to be catching his breath, or maybe to say as many things as he can before he needs to catch his breath. Or maybe it is just a way of making us read in the stream of consciousness that he is trying to replicate by this character of the narrator, where we seem to live, but who at the same time is quite philosophical. So, one of the things that I really appreciate in Proust is that he very often uses the word perhaps. He is observing, he is looking around, he is trying to find the values or the rules that he can apply to life in order to understand it. And therefore, his thinking is highly hypothetical. He is not always this affirmative. And that's why it is so easy to read this text, because you are watching and you are seeing what the narrator is seeing. You're experiencing what he's experiencing, and you are trying to accompany him and to understand what he perceives as being the truth behind the events that he is watching, that he is listening to and hearing and learning from others, or experiencing himself. So in real life, Sarah Bernhardt's most revered, the most famous play she ever played was precisely Phèdre. She apparently was exquisite in it, and it remained in history as one of the most acclaimed performances on stage. Therefore, here in the fictional Sarah Bernhardt, the Phèdre is also the object of desire for the narrator. And I think it is of note also, now that we're talking about the new developments of technology and therefore of performative art forms on stage, but also on film, on TV, that the way we saw theatre was very much an impersonation, a characterization of very well-known texts. And the notion of repetition is really important here. So the text that is said and performed by the actors is repeated in the philosophical sense of the word. Kierkegaard has a whole book about the notion of repetition. The notion of reproducing something means to create an experience that is repeated, but which will never be exactly the same. And the art, so the creation by the actress, Berma / Sarah Bernhardt, is going to be that differentiating element that is the impossibility of precisely repeating an experience. It's that unique moment and that unique aesthetic quintessential experience that is the work of art, or that is, or where lies the talent of the artist. And this is a very different relationship that we have with art nowadays. We are constantly in search of novelty, contrary to the narrator, and repeating, rewatching is something that is almost seen as a quirk in people who love the Lord of the Rings, or who love a particular piece of music. So keep that in mind. Again, experience, risk, expertise, knowledge through repetition, and also this way of experiencing deep talent. And the question is going to be, how will the narrator experience finally the acting of Berma, the text of Phèdre, and what will he take away from it? How will he assess this ability of finally being in front of what was inarguably perceived as one of the greatest artists of the time? And what is going to be his takeaway from it? So, this is the next excerpt that I'm going to read. The last moments of my pleasure were during the opening scenes of Phèdre. The heroine herself does not appear in these first scenes of the second act, and yet, as soon as the curtain rose, and another curtain, of red velvet this time, was parted in the middle, a curtain which was used to halve the depth of the stage in all the plays in which the star appeared, an actress entered from the back, who had the face and voice which, I had been told, were those of Berma. The cast must therefore have been changed. All the trouble that I had taken in studying the part of the wife of Theseus was wasted. But a second actress now responded to the first. I must then have been mistaken in supposing that the first was Berma, for the second even more closely resembled her, and more than the other had her diction. Both of them, moreover, enriched their parts with noble gestures, which I could vividly distinguish and could appreciate in their relation to the text, while they raised and let fall the lovely folds of their tunics, and also with skilful changes of tone, now passionate, now ironical, which made me realize the significance of lines that I had read to myself at home without paying sufficient attention to what they really meant. But all of a sudden, in the cleft of the red curtain that veiled her sanctuary, as in the frame, appeared a woman, and simultaneously with the fear that seized me, far more vexing than Berma's fear could be, lest someone should upset her by opening a window, or drown one of her lines by rustling a programme, or annoy her by applauding the others, and by not applauding her enough, in my own fashion, still more absolute than Berma's, of considering from that moment theatre, audience, play, and my own body only as an acoustic medium of no importance, save in the degree to which it was favourable to the inflections of that voice, I realized that the two actresses whom I had been for some minutes admiring bore not the least resemblance to her whom I had come to hear. But at the same time, all my pleasure had ceased. In vain might I strain towards Berma's eyes, ears, mind, so as not to let one morsel escape me of the reasons which she would furnish for my admiring her. I did not succeed in gathering a single one. I could not even, as I could with her companions, distinguish in her diction and in her playing intelligent intonations, beautiful gestures. I listened to her as though I were reading Phèdre, or as though Phèdre herself had at that moment uttered the words that I was hearing, without its appearing that Berma's talent had added anything at all to them. I could have wished so as to be able to explore them fully, so as to attempt to discover what it was in them that was beautiful, to arrest, to immobilize for a time before my senses every intonation of the artist's voice, every expression of her features. At least I did attempt, by dint of my mental agility in having, before a line came, my attention ready and tuned to catch it, not to waste upon preparations any morsel of the precious time that each word, each gesture occupied, and thanks to the intensity of my observation, to manage to penetrate as far into them as if I had had whole hours to spend upon them by myself. But how short their duration was! Scarcely had the sound been received by my ear than it was displaced there by another. In one scene, where Berma stands motionless for a moment, her arm raised to the level of a face bathed by some piece of stagecraft in a greenish light before a backcloth painted to represent the sea, the whole house broke out in applause. But already the actress had moved, and the picture that I should have liked to study existed no longer. I told my grandmother that I could not see very well. She handed me her glasses. Only when one believes in the reality of a thing, making it visible by artificial means is not quite the same as feeling that it is close at hand. I thought now that it was no longer Berma at whom I was looking, but her image in a magnifying glass. I put the glasses down, but then possibly the image that my eye received of her, diminished by distance, was no more exact. Which of the two Bermas was the real? As for her speech to Hippolyte, I had counted enormously upon that, since, to judge by the ingenious significance which her companions were disclosing to me at every moment in less beautiful parts, she would certainly render it with intonations more surprising than any which, when reading the play at home, I had contrived to imagine. But she did not attain to the heights which Enon and Aricie would naturally have reached. She planned down into a uniform flow of melody the whole of a passage in which there were mingled together contradictions so striking that the least intelligent of tragic actresses, even the pupils of an academy, could not have missed their effect. Besides which, she ran through the speech so rapidly that it was only when she had come to the last line that my mind became aware of the deliberate monotony which she had imposed on it throughout. Then at last a sense of admiration did possess me, provoked by the frenzied applause of the audience. I mingled my own with theirs, endeavouring to prolong the general sound so that Berma, in her gratitude, should surpass herself, and I be certain of having heard her on one of her great days. A curious thing, by the way, was that the moment when this storm of public enthusiasm broke loose was, as I afterwards learned, that in which Berma reveals one of her richest treasures. It would appear that certain transcendent realities emit all around them a radiance to which the crowd is sensitive. So it is that when any great event occurs, when on a distant frontier an army is in jeopardy, or defeated, or victorious, the vague and conflicting reports which we receive, from which an educated man can derive little enlightenment, stimulate in the crowd an emotion by which that man is surprised, and in which once expert criticism has informed him of the actual military situation, he recognizes the popular perception of that aura which surrounds momentous happenings and which may be visible hundreds of miles away. One learns of a victory either after the war is over or at once from the hilarious joy of one's hall porter. One discovers the touch of genius in Berma's acting a week after one has heard her in the criticism of some review, or else on the spot from the thundering acclamation of the stalls. But this immediate recognition by the crowd was mingled with 100 others, all quite erroneous. The applause came most often at wrong moments, apart from the fact that it was mechanically produced by the effect of the applause that had gone before. Just as in a storm, once the sea is sufficiently disturbed, it will continue to swell, even after the wind has begun to subside. No matter. The more I applauded, the better, it seemed to me, did Berma act. I say, came from a woman sitting near me, of no great social pretensions. She fairly gives it to you, she does. You'd think she'd do herself an injury the way she runs about. I call that acting, don't you? And happy to find these reasons for Berma's superiority, though not without a suspicion that they no more accounted for it than would for that of the Gioconda or of Benvenuto's Perseus, a peasant's gaping, "That's a good bit of work, it's all gold. Look, fine, ain't it?" I greedily imbibed the strong wine of this popular enthusiasm. I felt all the same, when the curtain had fallen for the last time, disappointed that the pleasure for which I had so longed had been no greater, but at the same time I felt the need to prolong it, not to depart forever. So you will have noticed the narrator doesn't recognize Berma, or rather identifies Berma with the actresses that play Phèdre, and he's very disappointed to see that Berma is not playing the main character. until finally she arrives and he is flabbergasted. She does not act in the exquisite way the other minor actresses do. She is monotonous and she is quick. She moves about. He is unable to isolate the moments that he wanted to study. What I love about this excerpt is that the narrator wants to isolate and to freeze the moments that he perceives as being particularly interesting or those really important moments in the text. But the acting is unstoppable. It is happening in time. It's a duration that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that frustrates him. It is really the description of an empirical encounter with a work of art for the first time. There's also the context, which is the people around him that represent society and society's evaluation of quality. He judges that the applause comes at the wrong moments, and he also is enthralled by the applause. The experience of applauding is a sort of a coded relationship with the actress. And he hypothesizes that perhaps these applauses are contributing to the exceptional performance as it progresses, or to the betterment or the improvement of the performance, because the actress, Berma, will receive that enthusiasm and the energy of the pleasure of the audience will infuse an even more inspired interpretation of the text by her. So this excerpt is incredibly complex. It has so much information about so many aspects of the experience of a work of art, of novelty, but also of engagement. There's so much talk about audience engagement nowadays, and this passage is particularly juicy when it comes to that, because it does talk about the taking into account the fact that, at least during a performance, the performer is in direct contact with the audience, despite having trained before, despite having had lots and lots of moments to study the text and the repetitions of the performance alone or in rehearsals. But that moment in time where there's a real encounter, and it's, I think, no coincidence that this reflection happens in a particular, very specific kind of artistic work, which is duration in time, that we recognize the role that we play in the making of an exquisite moment in time, but also in the making of talent. There is a participatory quality in the engagement with a piece of art, any piece of art. There is also this idea that it is a subjective experience. So, one of the things that happens is that in the passage, the narrator has a clear sense of the envelope that he inhabits, that is his body. And he connects that body with the audience's body, but also with an inner state that is completely turned outwards, that is absorbing everything that is happening. But one of the things that he relates before this passage, before finally getting to the theater experience, is the anxiety that he is in. And you will have noticed as well that one of the characteristics of the notion of art by Proust, there is absolutely a philosophical take that is very much his and very specific to him, is that art is everywhere. It is in cathedrals, for example. He considers Gothic cathedrals to be the highlight of French artistry. It is in interpreting a text, in acting. Acting is a work of art. It is an artistic, deep artistic experience. And in anything around you that is the outcome of a creative impulse. And therefore, he often compares pieces of literature, and here interpreting text, so a physical performance, almost a choreographed performance, with museum pieces. So the way Swann falls in love is when finally he identifies Odette, the cocotte, who ends up marrying, with one of the women painted by Botticelli. And in the same way, when the narrator is anticipating this theater experience, he talks about nature as he ends up talking about museum masterpieces. So there's a real entanglement of experience, not only of art, but also of love. And the notion of love, I think, is really important if you decide to read In Search of Lost Time, or if you're reading it, or if you have read it, you can go back to the experience of that particular oeuvre, and you can apply to the experiences related in time and space by the books to this notion of love. There is something called that I would call social love. There are these infatuations with things, with contexts, and also with the community of people that are attached to that aesthetic experience. So here, what I really love about this failed experience is that everything is taken into account. The place where it happens, the body that is receiving that information, that is experiencing that encounter, that aesthetic experience, is also associated with the people around it. And so the narrator has experienced a huge obsessive infatuation with Swann's daughter, who's called Gilberte. And all across the narration that leads to this moment, the character of Gilberte is deeply woven into the narrator's reflections. And so there's really no separating experiences of art and realizations and truth nuggets that we can derive from artistic prowesses, to those, or from those, of real life infatuations, real life feelings and emotions that are deeply entangled with desires, vocations, and mundane social encounters. Everything is woven together. In the first excerpt that I read is the question of the hierarchy. The notion of hierarchy was the one that Swann wasn't able to embrace fully. And it was the one that helped the narrator to perceive that Swann wasn't able to experience his own subjectivity. And here I would be tempted to say that Proust obviously wanted to be a writer as a person in his own life, and the narrator wanted to be a writer as well. There is a vocation and a reverence in regards to art and writing in general, but there is also a deep interest in desire, in lust, in love, and there isn't really a hierarchy when the narrator, and ultimately Proust himself as the author, when there is an exploration of something that maybe is the heart of all these things, including art, which might be the truth, which might be touching some form of meaning. But that meaning is not deeply hidden below the layers of experience. The meaning is interwoven in that experience, and perhaps even it might just be the experience itself. And what is that experience? So we're going to go into this notion of experience and try to learn a bit more about what Berma has taught the narrator in this first part of In Search of Lost Time. So let's move on to the next excerpt. And then, oh, the miracle. Like those lessons which we labored in vain to learn overnight and find intact, got by heart on waking up next morning, like to those faces of dead friends which the impassioned efforts of our memory pursue without recapturing them, and which, when we are no longer thinking of them, are there before our eyes, just as they were in life. The talent of Berma, which had evaded me when I sought so greedily to seize its essential quality, now, after these years of oblivion, in this hour of indifference, imposed itself with all the force of a thing directly seen on my admiration. Formerly, in my attempt to isolate the talent, I deducted, so to speak, from what I heard the part itself, a part common to all the actresses who appeared as Phèdre, which I had myself studied beforehand, so that I might be capable of subtracting it, of receiving in the strained residue only the talent of Madame Berma. But this talent, which I sought to discover outside the part itself, was indissolubly one with it. So with the great musician, it appears that this was the case with Vinteuil when he played the piano. His playing is that of so fine a pianist that one cannot even be certain whether the performer is a pianist at all, since, not interposing all the mechanism of muscular effort, crowned here and there with brilliant effects, all that spattering shower of notes in which at least the listener who does not quite know where he thinks that he can discern talent in its material, tangible objectivity, his playing is become so transparent, so full of what he is interpreting, that himself one no longer sees, and he is nothing now but a window opening upon a great work of art. So I'm skipping a paragraph here. So here is the rest of the excerpt. So Berma's interpretation was, around Racine's work, a second work, quickened also by the breath of genius. My own impression, to tell the truth, though more pleasant than on the earlier occasion, was not really different. Only I no longer put it to the test of a pre-existent, abstract and false idea of dramatic genius, and I understood now that dramatic genius was precisely this. It had just occurred to me that if I had not derived any pleasure from my first hearing of Berma, it was because, as early as still when I used to meet Gilberte in the Champs-Élysées, I had come to her with too strong a desire. Between my two disappointments, there was perhaps not only this resemblance, but another more profound. The impression given us by a person or a work, or a rendering for that matter, of marked individuality is peculiar to that person or work. We have brought to it the ideas of beauty, breadth of style, pathos, and so forth, which we might, failing anything better, have had the illusion of discovering in the commonplace show of a correct face or talent. But our critical spirit has before it the insistent challenge of a form of which it possesses no intellectual equivalent, in which it must detect and isolate the unknown element. It hears a shrill sound, an oddly interrogative intonation. It asks itself, is that good? Is what I'm feeling just now admiration? Is that richness of coloring, nobility, strength? And what answers it again is a shrill voice, a curiously questioning tone, the despotic impression caused by a person whom one does not know, wholly material, in which there is no room left for breadth of interpretation. And for this reason, it is the really beautiful works that, if we listen to them with sincerity, must disappoint us most keenly, because in the storehouse of our ideas, there is none that corresponds to an individual impression. This was precisely what Berma's acting showed me. This was what was meant by nobility, by intelligence of diction. Now I could appreciate the worth of a broad, poetical, powerful interpretation, or rather, it was to this that those epithets were conventionally applied, but only as we give the names of Mars, Venus, Saturn to planets which have no place in classical mythology. We feel in one world, we think, we give names to things in another. Between the two, we can establish a certain correspondence, but not bridge the interval. It was quite narrow, this interval, this fault that I had had to cross when, that afternoon on which I went first to hear Berma, having strained my ears to catch every word, I had found some difficulty in correlating my ideas of nobility of interpretation, of originality, and had broken out in applause only after a moment of unconsciousness, and as if my applause sprang not from my actual impression, but was connected in some way with my preconceived ideas, with the pleasure that I found in saying to myself, "At last, I'm listening to Berma." And the difference that there is between a person or a work of art, which is markedly individual, and the idea of beauty, exists just as much between what they make us feel and the idea of love or of admiration, wherefore we fail to recognize them. I had found no pleasure in listening to Berma any more than earlier still in seeing Gilberte. I had said to myself, well, I do not admire this. But then I was thinking only of mastering the secret of Berma's acting. I was preoccupied with that alone. I was trying to open my mind as wide as possible to receive all that her acting contained. I understood now that all this amounted to nothing more nor less than admiration. So this moment happens years after the first experience for the narrator to listen to Berma and to watch her acting. And here, he didn't expect anything. And that's one of the things that is characteristic of the moments before the narrator encounters theater and Berma for the first time, which is the anxious state in which he is and how he tries to prepare the experience by thinking of other masterpieces and going into his imaginary museum all the time and trying to define what that experience is going to be by defining in general what an aesthetic experience is. And even in that moment when he was so adamant in criticizing the adults around him, the fact that they didn't talk about great talent and they prefer to detail the impressions they had of Bergotte is quite interesting, because now he detaches notions of beauty as the planets that we call Greek names to are detached from mythology. Art is in a completely unknowable realm. It is perhaps even a real encounter with the unknown. It is an experience of openness that cannot be held or weighed by too much of a desire. Our desire to encounter great art cannot or can overpower that moment of sheer experience. And here I ask a question to you, dear listeners. Wasn't it important for the narrator to have had that experience first, that failed encounter with Berma, to then be able to appreciate a second experience of her acting? Isn't repetition something that is important and that was understood at the time when you went to theater? You already knew the text. Even in those new plays, the play was read, the play was known. The authors were contemporary authors that were revered, well, at least enough to be played by Sarah Bernhardt herself. So the parallels between Berma and Sarah Bernhardt, by the way, are very, very accurate. Bernhardt did at a certain point stop playing the classics and then went back to them. So here my question is, isn't really this moment of reckoning the real moment of reckoning? And there will be others, later on. This is not where the adventure stops with art, but it is the moment where art and love are placed more or less not at the same as an equivalence, but they are side by side. They're associated here. But the fact that Swann, the narrator, didn't identify the women they fell in love with immediately as being, as Proust writes, their type, inverted commas, isn't that the fact that perhaps it might be impossible for a singularity to encounter another singularity and enjoy the experience fully if there isn't a repetition, if there isn't a way to go back to that experience? That is one of the questions that I'm asking you. The second one is a notion of risk. So peritus, or the root of that word actually in Latin, implies the notion of risk. And it's so funny that in Portuguese, perito is someone who's an expert, another X word, which is actually exactly the same composition as the word experience. So there's in the story of this word experience notions of risk, notions of knowledge. So notions of complete mastering of a skill, a talent, something, a form of an art form, or some sort of duty or chore to perform. And there's also at the root of it the notion of repetition and the notion of risk. Maybe philosophically, this means that real experience, real openness, that is not at the height of desire, nor at the height of indifference, but somewhere in between. So this kind of intermediary state, which is the one that we have in our day-to-day lives when we encounter our environment, the people that we work with, that we live with, isn't that state the one that would be the ideal state to encounter a work of art? But also because we are aware, there is a consciousness of moving into a museum, opening the first pages of a book, listening to the first notes of a melody. Isn't the experience of art a tiny bit more complex than that? Because you have an awareness that you are encountering something new. There's a moment before where you weren't experiencing the work of art, and a moment during where you are in the depths of it. Isn't there a form of anxiety that one must rein in or hone in order to be ready to experience, to not to suspend judgment, and to really touch the raw state of that singularity or its outcome, as it were, in the shape of a work of art? And is not that really risking something? The notion of importance and the notion of hierarchy then comes into play. When we go into a museum, the hierarchy is already established. We already know what others, so the people applauding, have estimated to be works that either withstood the test of time or will withstand the test of time. So we already are in a sort of state of awareness that that has been chosen by someone else, and that someone else was a perito, an expert. And so when we enter the museum, we already are establishing a relationship with artworks that somehow are entangled in our own existence or with our own existence. We are already constellating something, and they are stars somewhere of that constellation because they are part of our culture or our experience and our reality. And so the necessity of maybe having a repeated experience with something that for some reason calls us, and sometimes something that has touched us, not in the best or more pleasurable of ways. Maybe that's the notion or the feeling that we should be pursuing. I think if you are um, a regular here in Exhibitionistas, you probably have listened to the episode about the Ed Atkins exhibition that I recorded with my friend Nick. And I told him that I really, really did not enjoy the first exhibition I saw of Ed Atkins's work. And I always, always think of La Berma when I have a very visceral, negative feeling when I visit an exhibition. I loved this passage of Berma when I started reading Proust when I was in the last years of teenagehood. And this passage here that I wanted to share with you today was so important to me. That really marked something in me because it is so true, isn't it? That sometimes we have feelings, we have a visceral or a profound, I wouldn't say dislike, but reaction, and we fail to find words even for it when we encounter a work of art. And that happened to me with Ed Atkins's work. And I remember going back home and thinking about the exhibition. A week passed, another week passed, another week, and I kept thinking about that experience to the point where I started thinking, I actually really like this work. And at the same time, to feel like the narrator did. Is the word like really appropriate? Is the word masterpiece really appropriate to talk about these works? Because the official reverence in regards to certain masterpieces or considered to be masterpieces is a very impure reality. They came to us for certain political, social reasons. They were revered in their time because some artists, not to name names, Picasso, were great promoters of their art and their talent because they were prolific, because they kept showing their work. And the more an artwork is shown, the more that experience of the artwork is repeated. And the more we are tempted to put that label on it that is beauty, great, good, exceptional work of art. So maybe it is worth keeping a lot of artworks revered, not revered, in the sort of purgatory of contemporary and art of any time where we don't quite know where they belong, because there might be someone who, through repeated experiences of that work, someday, one day, or eventually, perhaps, will feel that deep, visceral experience of singularity, of recognition, and of enhancement of their own being that is perhaps what could be best described as recognizing here and now, or perhaps 4 weeks later, that we were in the presence of great talent. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I just want to add a little parenthesis about Sarah Bernhardt. If you haven't read her biography, I really urge you to, because she was such a peculiar, incredible woman She did sleep in a coffin because it allowed her to rest. It allowed her to think about her roles and to meditate, I guess. Another thing that is worth visiting, and I will, or revisiting perhaps for some of you, and that I will leave you with, is her own voice. She was an innovator, and therefore she was not afraid of being recorded. And we have those recordings. So enjoy listening to the sound of her voice and perhaps even recognizing the famous monotonous and quick tone that the narrator, or Marcel Proust, described in one of the excerpts that you've just listened to.
Oui, prince, je l'enduis, je brûle pour tuer, je l'aime. Non point celle que l'on dit les enfers, volage, adorateur, venu d'objet divers, qui va du Dieu des morts, déshonorer la couche, mes fidèles, mes fiers, et même un petit farouche, charmant, jeune, traînant tous les cœurs après toi, celle qu'on défend aux dieux, ou celle que je vous vois.
All that said, don't forget, subscribe, follow, like, leave a comment, suggest books that you may want me to read, maybe perhaps contemporary books. Support us, donate if you can, be a good exhibitionista, go see exhibitions, read books, look around you, experience your surroundings like you experience any work of art as a real, ongoing encounter that is unable to be frozen. Take care. Have a good one. See you or hear you, or you hear me, or you see me in 2 weeks. Take care. Bye-bye.